Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast, where longtime strength and conditioning coach Tommy Moffitt explores everything from the art of coaching, improving performance, sports nutrition, and mental training. Now, welcome your host, Coach Tommy Moffitt.
Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast, and I'm your host, Tommy Moffitt. If you're listening for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. For more information about the Moffitt Method speed, strength, and conditioning programs, please visit our website, themoffittmethod.fit, or email us at info@themoffittmethod.fit. Our amazing guest today is Mr. Brandon Alley, founder and chief marketing officer for S2 Cognition. Brandon was a college athlete at the University of Tennessee in track and field from the early to mid-1990s. He then went on to get his PhD in neuropsychology from the University of Southern Mississippi in 2003. And then he did 2 postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard Medical School in cognitive neuroscience. He has been a faculty member in the departments of neurology and neurosurgery at Boston University and Vanderbilt. He is currently on faculty in sports medicine and neurosurgery, that's brain surgery, at the University of Louisville. He has authored 60 peer-reviewed publications and has written 6 book chapters on visual processing and memory. In 2014, he co-founded S2 Cognition. S2 is active in 10 different sports and other rapid decision-making verticals like special forces, law enforcement, and NASCAR. I think you're going to enjoy this one. Welcome to the podcast, Brandon.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
Yeah, great having you on here. I'm excited about this. And, people hear me talking about or referencing S2 all the time. So it's finally time to get you on here and let's talk some cognition and learning and see what we can expose, about the company and have a great conversation. So,
man, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So I want to get started here. First question. Can you describe, and this, I really want to know this. Can you describe the process of dropping your white lab coat and leaving the examination room for workout gear and hanging out with a bunch of coaches? What was that like?
Yeah, so it was interesting. For those of us in academics, about 10 years ago, bureaucracy was getting tighter, funding was getting tighter, and my waistline was getting a little tighter. So I definitely wanted to get into a pair of joggers and some workout gear and get outside of the lab. As you know, I was a college athlete. I was actually one of your college athletes once upon a time, and always stayed involved in sports, right? So it was continuously coaching, involved in a lot of youth sports, continued to be competitive myself. But really, it was a fighting balance for me was that, as you pointed out, I was both in the clinic seeing patients and in the lab, doing a lot of just basic cognitive science, so understanding how the brain works. And it really became quickly apparent to me that there was very little crosstalk between those two worlds. And so science as a whole has a difficult time with being applicable or using it in a practical setting. So we can understand like really specific details about how the brain works. Well, that does us no good if we can't sort of apply it. And a lot of that, as the real story behind this was that, Scott, so I was in Boston for 10 years. And then Scott, my current business partner and co-founder, I was at Vanderbilt, in the Department of Neurology and also in neurosurgery. And so I was a PhD in an MD based, department, and they literally stuck me in an abandoned hospital wing. That plastic surgery had just been gone, and I was just there by myself. And fortunately, a year later, Scott came from UVA, and he was a very similar situation. Scott played college baseball. Scott, my work really was based on understanding how we process visual information and how we lay that down into memories for later use. And Scott sort of really dovetailed nicely in that he is how we start, stop, switch, redirect our motor system based on what we see. And so we would spend evenings playing wiffle ball with the people in our labs down in this abandoned wing. And then, Scott, we had baseball players. Our boys played baseball. So we would dork out on, okay, what does the brain have to do to hit 100 miles an hour? We would whiteboard that for hours. And then we came up with a football battery. And literally the next day after we came up with the football battery, I said, I'm going to call Moffitt. Moffitt's at the top of this pyramid of performance. Let me call Moffitt and see what his thoughts were. And so that was the literal beginning. And I think that was like 2013 of how this got started. And, the story behind, we've used LSU and you guys for testing grounds and beta tests for a decade now, for just about everything we do to test out, try out things we're doing, get data, collect data, and things like that.
Yeah, it was a literal cold call. You called me, and I was like, "Yeah, I remember the Weasels," because that was y'all's nickname. But so y'all were just bored. So it wasn't some midlife crisis. You wanted to buy a Corvette or something, but y'all were just like bored.
God, no. And as you know, starting a business from something that is stable, right? I had stable income, stable life. I was on a trajectory. Leaving that to start this was no whim by any means. Yeah. But what really struck us was we watched the 2013 draft, the NFL draft, and they were using terms like, man, this kid plays faster than his foot speed, or he's got disciplined eyes, or he's got anticipation. It was like, wow, we actually measure this kind of stuff in the lab every day. We could probably help these coaches and these scouts kind of understand what they're talking about, sort of quantify that a little bit. And it was only after 2 years of I was covering Scott's clinics when he was at spring training. He was covering my clinics when I was at the combine. We were like, yeah, enough of this. Let's give this a shot.
Yeah. All right. So can you describe the setup and the procedure for administering the test for those that are unfamiliar with how you actually do the testing?
Yeah, sure. So we have two main products now, which is a little bit different than when we started. So at the college and professional level, where big time decisions are being made, we really, really focus on being precise, very, very precise at the millisecond level. So 1/1000th of a second. So we have these gaming laptops with these specialized display with really, really high refresh rates so that we know exactly when pixels are coming on, exactly how long something is on the screen. And then we have these third-party button boxes, response pads that have an internal clock in it that actually captures response times within the 1 to 2/1000ths of a second.
So let me ask you this. How fast is 1/1000th of a second? Faster than the blink of an eye?
Oh, the blink of an eye is about 300/1000th of a second. It's about a third of a second, maybe a little bit faster than that. Yeah. So a hitter, just to put it in perspective, a hitter hitting 95 miles an hour has about 386 milliseconds, so 386/1000th of a second to process all of that and initiate a swing. So some of the stuff we're doing is really, it hadn't been reported in the literature. We've got guys on LSU's football team who can see 15/1000th of a second, which at one time was thought to be impossible. So we come in with our laptops. You're familiar with this, and test big groups of guys at the youth level where we're really focused on player development, right? You're not making scouting decisions or big dollar decisions. We're on the Xbox. So the latest version of the Xbox, you do have to have a specialized display and you have to have a specialized wired remote control.
And the reason that is because the refresh rate of the computer screen and the memory within the device just doesn't operate at a speed that is fast enough to actually do the measurements that you're doing for even young kids, correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We have
It's
an
amazing.
IT team of 5 guys who really do a phenomenal job. They take all of these devices apart. They use oscilloscopes and high-speed cameras to really, we have to know exactly when something is presented on the screen, when that pixel deluminates. So it gets a little heady at times, but when the difference between an NFL starting running back and a guy who never really sees the field can be between 14 and 21 thousandth of a second, that's a big deal. We can't miss time like that. So that's why we're really precise.
Now, do the test subjects still wear the noise canceling headphones? And
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our tests, and it's different for every sport or any vertical we're in. They have headphones on. They get audio and visual instructions. They go through a practice phase. As you know, we've got these thresholds built into the test itself to determine if the kid is randomly responding or if he's giving sub-maximal effort and things like that. So it's come a long way since the initial
yeah,
version.
yeah. So when we first started the testing, and the test was an hour long, and I would sit there and watch the guys take the test, and it's a tough test. It's
Yeah,
not, you're not sitting there playing a video game. I mean, it's
right.
actual work. If especially if you know that millions of dollars are on the line, you're working your butt off to make sure that you respond as quickly as you possibly can to the stimuli. Awesome.
Yep.
All right. So
It is.
yeah,
It's challenging for sure.
yeah, yeah. I've heard some groans, and I've heard some sounds come out of guys. Like you can tell that they're struggling at taking
Oh yeah.
at the
Well,
challenge. It's
well,
challenging.
as a weight coach, you'd really appreciate this, and this is sort of some of our pitch to the athletes as they come in. We're trying to find their cognitive capacity. So on 9 different skills, we're trying to find their capacity. So it is exactly like going into the weight room and trying to find what your 1 rep max is. I always tell the guys, 2 things are going to happen. One is it's going to hurt a little, and 2, you're going to fail. That is our objective, is try to find your point of failure. So if we're testing your impulse control system, we're going to make you fail. We're going to find where that point of failure is. And I think it's difficult sometimes for really elite athletes who just are not used to failure.
Yeah.
They're not used to feeling that, like, man, I got my ass handed to me there. Right. So
Yeah.
it has that feeling to it a lot for these guys.
Yeah. So, how do you go about measuring the decision making process in athletes? How's that process broken down?
Yeah, this is part of the unique process that I think that sort of separates S2 with some other decision-making companies, is that Scott and I, first of all, we didn't invent anything in the test battery. We also didn't take something off of the shelf like an IQ test or classic decision-making test. The way we went about this is, and this is where we're really fortunate having relationships like with you guys, is we're going to sit down with a position coach and a player and ask them, what are the demands of your position? That's the first thing we always ask. What's your decision making bottlenecks? What kind of mental mistakes do you make? All of those sorts of things, to try to come up with a complete picture of the cognitive demands of that position or sport. And then we go to science. Then we go to the scientific literature, and we see, Scott and I kind of covered the gamut with visual input to motor output. Some of these may have been tests we use in the lab for decades. Some of them may be in tests that have been in other labs around the world, but we try to find the best measure we can to get at what that coach wants to get at. And so we test at the systems level. And I say that, and I think as a performance coach, you would understand this. So we test the impulse control system. So we go to the literature, you tell us, okay, so motor impulsivity for a lineman might be jumping off sides on a hard count, or for a hitter, chasing a pitch in the dirt. We see it happen all the time. So for that motor control, we're going to go find the task in the scientific literature that has robust test retest reliability, no practice effects, those kinds of things. And we're going to test that athlete's system. So it's the same impulse control system that if you're sitting at a traffic light and the turn lane next to you, that arrow turns green, sometimes we impulsively hit the gas and then we've got to hit the brake. That's your impulse control system. It's the same one that prevents us from swinging at sliders in the dirt, from jumping on a head fake or a pump fake, from jumping on a hard count. Yeah. So when we can measure and quantify that system, And here's where the magic of S2 comes in, but also some of the myths in it, right? You can always say, so this is not a one-to-one analog. It's not a crystal ball. But if I know that an athlete has at the systems level poor impulse control, you can kind of assume they're going to make some impulsive mistakes. So if it's a cornerback, you can assume they may fall prey to some double moves. They may get handsy and grab a jersey when they feel like they're getting burned. That's the kind of information we're giving coaches, not this sort of crystal ball. I feel like, we've taken a bashing in the media recently, particularly with CJ Stroud, about, okay, so how do you have some low scores and play well? Well, A, it's not a crystal ball. B, that's your job as a coach. We have how many performance coaches? Why? Because we want to try to improve their weak spots and lean into their strengths. So if we can program around the way an athlete is made to process information, man, we're light years ahead of just guessing, can this kid do this? So, the real applicable piece of that is, okay, I've got a quarterback. We do tracking capacity, which the one where you've got to keep track of all this information. Well, if you score low there, we've heard coaches describe them as having a little bit of tunnel vision, right? Okay, so does that mean you can't play quarterback? No, but that does mean you may struggle in a Shanahan offense when you're trying to make reads from sideline to sideline. In TCU's offense, where you're doing high-low progressions, you may be gold in there. Yeah. So it's really understanding an athlete, and then the real hard work and magic comes from taking what we know about how that athlete processes information, and then let's scheme for that athlete. Let's scheme of what that athlete can do well and try to minimize what they can't do well.
Exactly. So, for instance, if you're lining up in 5 wide receiver set with a bunch of motions and stuff, a guy could get confused by how the defense is shifting and moving compared to lining up with 2 wide receivers and 2 backs in the backfield and a tight end, and knowing exactly where everyone's lined up without any motions and given no reads or not even a second play call. That's going to be a lot easier for someone who's lacking in that area versus someone who is strong and can handle more stimuli in I don't know, 3 seconds or less.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, you've seen this in action at LSU. I mean, we have quarterbacks that, like with the decision complexity measure, once you start layering up more than 2 if-then rules, so if the X does this and the Y is coming across the middle, here's what I do. If they can't if more than 2 reads become complex and they've got a real high improvisation score, let them play. Let them be a baller, right? Don't try to overscript those kids. Right. We see that all the time, especially at schools like LSU, Alabama. You've got these really athletic kids that if you played 7-on-7 with no plays, they would destroy everybody. But then when you start scripting the game, it becomes difficult, right? And so really, Scott and I just took what we know from the lab-based science to measure what these kids can do, and then sort of what the lab tells us about how we improve these skills.
All right. So I want to step back a little bit from football and athletics. So when you say it came from the lab, what was the purpose of this type of research in the lab? What were you looking for?
Yeah. So I'll just give you the example from my own career, right? I when I worked in the clinic, my primary role was to try to identify Alzheimer's disease at its very earliest point. And so after about a decade of that, I came to realize just by using some of these tests that it's actually, this is going to really nerd out, but entorhinal cortex is a brain structure that the visual system innervates, and that's where it puts vision and memory together. So it kind of encapsulates visual memory for later use. And that is ground zero for Alzheimer's. So we were using these tests in the lab to say, okay, these people who are at really high risk for Alzheimer's disease genetically, we've done genetic tests, all these things, they have these very subtle visual discrimination problems. And that's the earliest symptom. So while there are researchers out there that are doing this type of research just to understand how the brain works, like how does the visual system work, we were taking it a step further. Okay, if we know that this is how the brain works, this can help us understand how the brain breaks down, right? And so
you're reverse engineering it.
Yeah, and it became a conflict for me because I'm in the clinic using these really old 1920 measures to try to tell this person if they have Alzheimer's disease. But I can't bill for the lab-based stuff. So I'm in there using some of this lab-based stuff in there to try to help inform these decisions. And so that's exactly what we're doing here, is just taking those lab-based metrics that were built to understand how the brain works and applying it to this really elite population. So rather than my clinic where it's the other end of the spectrum where life is starting to break down, now we're talking about kids that are just elite. Yeah.
So, and here's when I would explain to someone what S2 was, I always tried to make sure that I told them that you guys weren't, you and Scott were not a couple of old strength coaches who had gotten fired from their last job and came up with this, that you were like medically driven. This was medically driven evidence for an elite population of people based on, hard science from, and obviously now from the lab. We all know it comes from the lab. And that's what's always been so intriguing about this for me, is because I knew the background of it. And again, it wasn't two old strength coaches who decided to start a business.
Yeah, and that was the first barrier to entry into high level college and pro sports. As you know, you guys don't just do something because it sounds good now, right? You've got to have science behind it, data behind it, evidence behind it. And like I was talking about our impulse control test, that test has literally been studied for 60 years. If you were to Google, the Simon task, there are probably 10,000 papers on that to understand everything from test retest reliability to how certain medications. So if you want to start talking about your athletes on ADHD meds, we know how ADHD meds push that around, sleep deprivation, fatigue of a long season. We know how all of that pushes these processes around. Yeah. So again, is it a one-to-one analog for what these guys have to do on the field? No, I can't simulate Saturday night in Death Valley. But I know how the brain operates, and we can make some pretty good assumptions about how it affects play.
Yeah. And I know this from, because I've heard your example before of sitting at a red light and impulse control. So every time I sit at a red light and the car next to me goes and I take my foot off the brake, I go, golly, I always think of you. So without taking the test, I know I lack a little impulse control.
I don't think you could be a high level strength coach at an SEC school and not have a little lack. Like it's so funny because we get into these discussions too. Like, don't you want somebody with a 99 on impulse control? Actually, you don't. You want somebody who can pull the trigger. You want somebody who's a little loosey goosey sometimes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I never had a problem with pulling the trigger either.
No.
I can promise you that. All right, so let's talk cognition. Can you improve cognition? And can you give us an example for the sport of football?
Yeah, for sure. So we view improving cognition in two different ways. One of them is quick fixes, and the other one is true player development work, true improvement, changing the way the brain is wired, those kinds of things, which take a long time, right? And coaches get frustrated after a while. But I do want you to think about this in terms of like brain. We just came out of the decade of the brain with Lumosities of the world and all these brain training apps. Do they work? Well, you'll get better at the Lumosity game. So if you want to improve, let's say we want to improve, let's use, because baseball is really easy because it's literally one position. It's hitter, right? It's one position. It's hitter. It's very static. We can quantify that. So we can look at ways. If you were to say, hey, take this app home and do this for 30 minutes a day and you'll improve your chase rates, walk away as fast as you can. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
You've got to do it in the context. You've got to do it as close to the game situation as you can. So we build out a progression and a structure over 8 weeks of how to decrease chase rates, primarily for specific pitches. So Dallas Baptist is a good example. We work with these guys. Actually, LSU is another good example. Hey, coach, what's your biggest chase pitch? Well, sliders in the dirt. Okay, so we put hitters through 8 weeks of very systematically progressing them to keep away from the slider in the dirt. We actually improved DBU's team chase rates 14%. Coach said got him 250 at bats back the season. So then we looked at high fastballs just out of the zone. Didn't improve that much. So that's very contextually specific. So we did another 8 weeks with high heaters. Again, we reduced chase rates by 18% for high heaters. So it's got to be very specific. If you want to improve cognition, you're not going to do a bunch of shit to improve your S2 score. You've got to do whatever you do to improve on the field. So if you want to keep your O lineman from jumping off sides on the hard count, we've got to devise a very, very specific way to improve that in the context on the field. Same thing with quarterbacks throwing interceptions with low impulse control, those kinds of things. So we've got to understand how the brain works. And again, as you know, Scott and I aren't coaches, but we can help the coaches provide a conceptual framework for this is how you improve performance. And coaches are really good at saying, oh, dude, I've got a drill like this. 9 times out of 10, what we come into contact with, their coaches are just too greedy. They try to get too much done with one drill. So let's back it up a little bit and isolate that very specific thing that we're trying to work on and then progress it.
Right. That's where you're actually, and I remember a long time ago, we were talking about this. And I think we were talking about David Lipscomb at the time, how their staff took the numbers, you called it, they take the numbers to the field and they set up buckets based on what their team was lacking. And they place those individual players in those buckets and practice those drills for the entire team. So you have periods, just like in football, you would set up a period of practice. And now there's so many analysts and coaches and GAs. If you're an old line guy, you just set up a couple of buckets and you can knock that out. And it's not like you're spending an hour a day on the task because they're, like you said, they're very specific tasks that you're working on.
Yeah, that's right. In baseball, it's grown quite a bit. So we actually have major league teams that bend kids by cages now. We look at it depending on at your level. So at the college level, if you can work on this 30 minutes 2 times a week, so an hour of your week, you can see significant improvement. So some college teams will have kids with low impulse control work in this cage, and then kids with timing problems. So they have trouble adjusting from fastball to off speed work in this cage. Mm-hmm. And what we've found is if you can spend about 20% of your daily, like that, if you do it 2 days a week, for those 2 days, if you can spend about 20% of your time working on that, it's a really good balance. Because just like the test, this kind of work is challenging. You're challenging, you're reworking what they're used to doing. You're changing the way the brain is wired. So it becomes a little frustrating. So how you stack that, you may have, they're hitting 75-mile-an-hour fastballs out of the park for a little bit, and then you're challenging them for a little bit, and then you're making them feel good again. So you're getting in work, 2-3 days a week for 20, 30 minutes a day, and you're really seeing improvement in some of these skill sets.
Yeah. And teams now practice year round.
Yeah.
Now summer league for college baseball players takes them away, but even at a place like LSU, if a guy played a lot of innings and if he was banged up a little bit at the end of the season, they give that guy a break now. And, especially if he's a veteran, they give him a break, let him stay in Baton Rouge and train. And for football, a sport like football, they train year round. They're working year round because there's no summer leagues. So, and in the field of strength and conditioning and all of collegiate athletics now, we measured everything. And that's why this test was intriguing for me, because the first time y'all sent us the original report. Of course, in the weight room, we read through them all immediately, and we were like, "Holy mackerel!" We saw some of the similar, we saw some of those similar traits in our interaction with them in the weight room.
Yeah.
So my question is here: how does cognition interact with other aspects of their performance, like speed, strength, agility, etc.?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and one that it's complex. So we are measuring brain speed and brain performance. You still have to wire that up to the physical characteristic, whatever it is, right? Swinging the bat, lifting in a certain way. And you and I have talked about a number of your athletes that had low instinctive learning, which is your ability to pick up on very subtle cues and patterns and probabilities. And you could teach a kid something and he sees a cue, feels a cue, he's got it. And then the next day in the weight room, gone, doesn't remember it at all. Right. And so
would not remember the barbell warm up.
Right.
Something that we would do repetitively over time. It just never stuck.
Yeah. And so there's some interplay with, how you're teaching this, right? I think some of that, there's some ways that you can make learning more efficient in that way. But obviously the way it interacts with is, I think that, when we start looking at performance, you can really see the interaction. And, LSU DBU, right? So let's think about some defensive backs we've had. If you have low impulse control as a defensive back, you're frequently going to be in the wrong position because you fall prey to a double move or you fall prey to a misdirection. I mean, that's why we still run those plays, is because they capitalize on the way the brain is wired. But the athleticism of some of these guys, right? So it interacts with their speed, their jumping ability. So some guys who may be in the wrong position because of their impulsivity can get back really quickly because they're faster, they can jump. So they may not make the interception, but they, interfere with the play enough to get a deflection or something like that. So really, and I know that you and I and Jack Marucci talked about this probably 10 years ago. It still has yet to come to fruition, but we're getting closer about, can we kind of handicap some of these physical metrics? So if a kid runs 4.4, but his S2 shows that he's X amount slower than the average DB, maybe he plays like a 4.65 DB. So we can kind of come up with a little bit of a picture there. But, we're measuring the brain's ability to process. You guys are measuring the physical characteristics. Obviously, when you start thinking about motor neuron recruitment and all those things, of course it interacts. It's got to interact.
Yeah. All right. So the best example, and it's the opposite of the one that you just gave about a guy having a good S2 score or having a poor S2 score, but he's faster, and then he can, he's more, apt to make a play. Jarvis Landry ran 4.69, but everyone knows that, the type of player Jarvis was. And, Jarvis made up for that, although he ran 4.69, which is, slower than your average, I would say your average wide receiver in the NFL, but he ran great routes. He had strong hands. He was, his improv score, if we would have tested him, would have probably been amazing. He would have been able to judge angles, very well and make adjustments to the ball and et cetera. So obviously, that goes both ways. But what I wanted to ask you is, so the latest and the greatest as a strength coach passed before my computer screen every day through emails and, social media and just cold calls that I got, similar to the one that you gave us. But there's all kinds of devices out there. There's virtual reality devices. There's the light boards where, it's kind of like playing Simon Says on a light board. There's those sticks and wands that you throw to people, different balls. You have all types of tools. how effective are those devices in improving um, cognition and impulse control, et cetera?
Yeah.
Or are they in left field? What's your
No, great
opinion on
question.
that?
And something that Scott and I literally deal with on a daily basis. Really what you're doing there, Tommy, is you are training at the systems level. And so we always, and I'm sure you guys talk in a similar vernacular in the strength world, we worry about transfer effects.
Yes.
Are we improving something, for a lack of a better term, in the lab that doesn't transfer to improving this athlete's game? So in everything we do, we want to try to come up with some outcome measures, and the outcome measures are performance related, not specific to that. So if you were just to do the light board, are you going to improve your light board score? Probably so. That's what you're training to do. Is that going to make you pay more attention as a defensive back? I think the literature shows that not really. That's too far of a transfer for that. So you are working at the systems level. It's hard to know right now, especially in elite performers. I think the literature generally uses your common undergraduate, and there's not a lot of transfer. Now, does that mean these elite performers where you're already operating at a high level, can there be some transfer there? I'm not sure. There's no evidence to suggest it, but perhaps you are fine tuning to a level that can transfer. If there's something more closely aligned to what that athlete has to do on the field, then yes. Virtual reality and augmented reality. Now, this is something I love to dig into. So 5 years ago, I would have said not a chance. In the last 5 years, man, this has come a long, long way. Right now in sports like football, I am very comfortable with taking those off-field reps where you're getting a lot of reps and not taking the physical abuse. So one thing we work with a lot of coaches on is being able to pick up on cues, right? So we need to do that in isolation. And let's just say we're talking about either a receiver or a quarterback, right? I'm going to be really elementary here, so I apologize if I'm offending you football people out there. But the basic, if he covers the curl, you throw to the flat. If he covers the flat, you throw to the curl. Let's just take that decision, right? A lot of times coaches just run that and they're randomly going about it, hoping the kid gets better at it, right? Yeah. What you have to do is practice that in isolation. So you're just practicing the curl, the curl, the curl, the curl, while the quarterback needs to be focusing on, okay, what is the hip angle of the DB? What are the feet placement? Where are the shoulder plate? What cues is the DB giving me that he's going to cover the flat so that I'm throwing to the curl? You've got to rep that for some kids. Again, the learning curve here is steeper for some than others. But what you're trying to do is get your quarterback to get, okay, what are all those cues telling me the DB is going to do? Once he has that, then you go to the flat, right? Then you're picking up all of the cues on what he's giving you when he's covering the curl. Life is not that simple, right? Sometimes he'll just stand there. Sometimes he'll run. I mean, you've got to add the complexity to it, but you've got to do it in isolation. Then we simply mix 50-50. So everybody still knows what's coming. I'm going to the curl. I'm going to the flat. You're picking that up, but you're having to flexibly adjust. Then you go to game speed where you're doing it. Nobody knows what's coming but the DB. Those kinds of reps can be done in VR. You can get those reps that are giving you cues, the things that these quarterbacks are getting really good at now, picking up pre-snap formations. What are they likely to do out of this formation? Just post-snap, okay, how are they playing me? I think the ability to get reps like that are extremely valuable. Here's the kicker. In a sport like baseball, where the difference between hitting one squarely and fouling one off is about 17/1000th of a second, you just don't have the resolution of time in the virtual environment right now. And so you can really mess a kid up. So if he's taken 1,000 reps in that VR in baseball and he's training himself, not intentionally, to be 17/1000th of a second off, when he gets into reality, he's going to be late. Also, the spatial resolution isn't quite there. If you talk to baseball players like Austin Nolan, those guys, they'll tell you it doesn't look right. The spin of the ball doesn't look right. So I don't know if you've seen this, and I don't know if I don't think LSU has one of these yet, but I know the Padres have because Austin sent me some footage. They have this new digital pitching machine. It's wild, Tommy. The hole moves where the ball comes out of it. And they have video footage of every pitcher throwing every pitch. And it takes all of the camera information. So spin rate, trajectory, and the ball comes out of this machine just like the pitcher throws it. So taking those kind of reps can be really cool. But I think in football, I think VR is really advancing the way that we can train.
Yeah, so they would be getting that data from the TrackMan device because I know Clay would tell me about how many degrees his arm slot changed from inning to inning. And then some games, when he would be off, he would say, I was off because my arm slot was off X number. And then one of the reasons he was effective, his fastball wasn't fast, but the spin rate on it was fast enough that it caused hitters issues. And so that's why he was effective. He knew for consistency, he had to make sure his arm slot was in the correct position. And again, all of that came from the TrackMan. So I would imagine they reverse engineer the data that they get from the TrackMan.
That's exactly right. In these machines, you can go say, hey, I want to face, Clayton Kershaw, and they'll have all of his spin rate, all of that data, and they will replicate the pitch being thrown.
And then all right, so here's, I'm going to give a shout out to Marucci and Micah Gibbs. So what Micah Gibbs does is he through science, through a lab, the professional players lab here in Baton Rouge at the Marucci facility, he looks at the different handle and knob combinations that give you the weight of the bat and how the weight is distributed in the bat and how effective you are at hitting different pitches. So they make adjustments to the bat to help you. So if you took that along with the bat design, because they can throw different pitches and stuff, and they've determined that certain bat weights and balance of the weight within the bat and the length and the grip and the knob increase your effectiveness with hitting different pitches.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how, especially in a sport where, the margin for error is so small, how streamlined this process is getting in preparing players for elite level competition.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Micah is super smart.
Yeah. And then the best thing about it is there's the trickle down effect because it starts, I think I would say the collegiate level when it comes to this type of stuff is probably a little ahead of some professional organizations because they're going to give you the stereotypical, we've always done it this way answer to things, and they're hard-headed about change. But for the most part, I think a lot of this type of technology starts in the collegiate realm where it's tested and proven to be effective, and then it goes up and trickles down. But that's cool. All right, so we've got a good baseline here on cognition training and stuff. So how do you use this data on an athlete's of an athlete's cognition scores in college and in the professional setting to help those athletes perform better on game day? Like, how do you take the science or the numbers to the field to make sure that those guys are better on game day?
Yeah, great question. That's really the bulk of what we do and how we started and the sphere we want to be in. We never really wanted to be part of the selection process. We kind of got drug into that. You know how all that started, but really, as we talked about earlier, like it's changing a little bit in the draft room. So we get asked frequently, or I guess they ask internally, what is the vision for this particular player? Right. And there was a time where we would just take the best defensive back on the board. This kid is an unbelievable defensive back and hope that he can do what you want him to do. Well, now there are 17 different types of defensive backs, the kinds of things that you're going to ask this kid to do, right? And so really the questions in the draft room to us and the ways that we help like college teams with guys on their roster is, here is how this athlete is wired to perform really well. What situations can we put that kid in to maximize that? Right. So if you've got a guy who has really high perception speed, he can see things very quickly. He may not be able to track things very well. He's got phenomenal control over his motor system. He can improvise very well, and he's not distractible. That kid is wired up to play press corner. He is a 1v1 machine. You put him in a zone or a nickel situation, the kid's going to struggle. He's got a little bit of tunnel vision. There are different cognitive skills that athlete needs. So really, that's where we try to help college teams, is to understand, okay, here's how this athlete is wired. Let's use him that way. Let's use him in those situations. You got a really low impulsive kid who's got great search efficiency, low motor control. I'm describing a heat-seeking missile. Yeah. How many heat-seeking missiles has LSU had that's been highly successful, right? And so here's what he can do well. Let's put him in those situations. In the flip side of that, if there are ways that we can mitigate his weaknesses. So, LSU had a linebacker at one point that, you guys were pressing up on the line, that had low perception speed. And it was really a matter of, hey, can we just pull him off a step and a half? That'll literally give him a quarter of a second more to visually process what's coming at him. Made all the difference in the world, right? I mean, Deion Jones is a good example. Deion was being used as an outside linebacker, didn't play much through his junior year. And we said, hey, guys, this guy is built.
Mad. I'd get text messages after the game.
Put the kid in the middle of the field. Please put the kid in the middle of the field. Turns out he's a 6th-round draft pick, all pro middle linebacker, right? So it's really, it's knowing how these kids are wired and using them in those positions. Now, I'll tell you a story. You brought up Lipscomb. Paul Phillips was the guy who was the coach there. He's now actually works for us full time, but there was a kid there that had a pattern of scores that Paul was like, man, I hate to tell this kid, because he was hitting 7th. We're going to use him as a pinch hitter, but we're going to use him frequently because he can really do this very well. And obviously the kid didn't want to be a pinch hitter, right? This sucks, but he was scuffling, right? He was batting 220 the whole time. So now the kid, they use him probably 2 out of every 3 games. He's knocking in some RBIs late in the game. He's hitting 650, which now he's on cloud 9. The team is playing well, but he was relegated to a position where didn't really want to play that, right? But turns out that's where he was kind of wired for. That's what he was kind of built for.
Yeah, and I can think of a lot of different examples where, coaches would try to force a kid into a specific role. And we'll talk about this a little later, but where the kid was unsuccessful. And then when kids are unsuccessful, they're not happy. And then they start second guessing themselves, and then they underperform, and it just exasperates the everything.
The coach gets super frustrated too.
Oh, yeah, because they're the ones that recruited him. All right, so while we're on this, I want you, because this is so cool, and I'm glad that we're doing this. But can you explain the difference in demands for, say, an inside linebacker and a corner? Give our listeners a little perspective on the differences, how inside linebacker, because you use Deion Jones, an inside linebacker and a wide receiver would be different.
Yep. So an inside linebacker has to have 2 main traits. The number one thing we see at really successful middle linebackers in the NFL is our measure of decision complexity. So it's those if-then rules. So if the tight end comes across the middle, here's what I do. If the running back does this, here's what I do. You've got to layer on those rules, right? And here's the difference really between what we would call football IQ, which is sort of knowing those rules. And this is where a lot of coaches get frustrated. they make the mistake. The kid hesitates. He does the wrong thing. And you ask him, dude, what are you supposed to be doing? And he can tell you right away. There's a huge difference in that football IQ, that situational awareness of what you're supposed to do and executing what you're supposed to do in less than 0.2 of a second. So for a middle linebacker, that is absolutely critical, is filtering through those if-then decisions. It's just those read-react choices. The second most important thing is your ability to control your impulses. So as a middle linebacker, if you fall prey to misdirection, they will take you out of the play. You know, you're just getting hammered. And so that's very critical. And then our third skill there is your ability to see the whole field. So you've got to keep track of potential flyers from each outside of each tackle. You've got to keep track of the quarterback, maybe a running back filtering out to a screen. You've got to see all of that information. For an even outside linebacker, that's not as critical, right? You don't need to see the whole field. You just need to see a certain area, but you have to, our search efficiency measure, you've got to search through this visual chaos to locate your target. Your target may be the quarterback. It may be a back coming out of the backfield. It may be the ball. So there are different sort of cognitive demands. Obviously, a wide receiver, we've seen two things. One, that search efficiency. So how quickly you can turn and locate a target is a high predictor of drop rate. And also impulse control is also a predictor of drop rate, mainly because those kids see open field and they turn and run before they actually execute the catch. So those are some skills that are important for wide receivers. But really, you know, we've worked hard over the last couple of years we've got now about 6,000 NFL players to look and see at each position, you know, what skills matter at each position. Yeah.
And I think I've seen some of those works, and it's amazing how precise your measurements are and your recommendations for thresholds within those different positions. And you know, the biggest one is the position of quarterback, and I think, you know, y'all pretty much nailed what the demands of an elite quarterback or their thresholds for the different categories of the test, how important those categories are, that they fall within those thresholds, and how effective they are on game day. I thought that was really super.
Yeah, some of those, particularly the middle of the field, quarterback, both defensive back positions, wide receiver, linebackers, we're very good at. I think we struggle a little bit at the line positions. I think for primarily two reasons. One is I think the cognitive demands of some of the line are just different. You know, we as you know, the NFL teams wanted us to keep the battery the same for every position, so they could have the same battery year over year and everything. But I think linemen do things differently, right? So we have in other sports, we have leverage, we have angle judgment, we have rhythm control, so cadence and those kinds of things, which are important to linemen that we don't really measure. So I don't think we accurately measure everything or adequately measure everything linemen do. And then the other side of that is the physical aspect. Like, this is football, right? And so let's think if you've got a defensive end like Myles Garrett, who's 6'6", 300 pounds, but can run 4.5, if the guy can run you over or run by you, it doesn't matter how many objects he can track, right? It doesn't matter. The kid's got physical skills. So, right. I mean, there's some positions, there's some players that, you know, it's a give and take. And it's also a tolerance thing, Tommy. We talk about this a lot in baseball. So impulse control is going to lead to a lot of strikeouts. You're going to be swinging a lot of pitches out of the zone. Well, if you've got a cleanup hitter who's hitting 40-plus dingers and driving in 100 RBIs, you're going to tolerate that impulse control. You're going to tolerate the Ks, not your leadoff guy. You're not going to tolerate swinging at pitches off on the lead. So it's about tolerance and about your where your kids are playing and those kind of things.
Yeah, Clay was talking to some professional baseball scouts and agents and stuff about when a player goes to arbitration. Two of the two things they look at is exit velocity, and that's what you're talking about. You know, if you hit the ball hard and you know your exit velocity is 104 miles per hour, they're going to put up with some strikeouts.
That's right.
They're going to put up with a few Ks from you because they know that when you do make contact, the ball's going to go real far. It's going to be hit hard, and they feel like they can improve upon that some. But if a guy lacks power and isn't making contact, then you know they know that it's going to require more work. And then the second one, of course, is innings played. So the two primary things that they look for is exit velocity, innings played. So if you're injured often, or for some reason you just can't play an entire game because of you get mentally fatigued, or you're exhausted, or just can't handle the grind of a minor league or professional season, you're not going to be out there on the field. Then you're not worth anything, or you're worth a lot less to the organization.
Right.
Okay, so we were talking about different batteries, and that was going to be a question about how specific are the test batteries by the different positions. All right, so that leads me to this. So you basically explained that already. So how are the test batteries different for the different sports? Um, and I'm sure there's differences across the board for all the different sports. So you obviously have different test batteries now for different sports as well.
Yeah, every sport we do has a different battery. There are some overlap because a lot of athletes have to do the same thing, especially in these dynamic sports like football, soccer, volleyball, lacrosse, hockey. All of those sports that are more dynamic rather than hitter. We even have a golf battery that is it's actually to be honest with you, it's the same battery as a field goal kicker and a pitcher. Yeah, so it's the approach, right? We look at risk tendencies, risk reward. Do you like going for, do you like taking the risk to go for high reward, or do you play it conservative? How well do you judge angles? How well can you limit your distractions? All of those sorts of things. So it's different for every sport. And again, I do want to be clear there. Scott and I don't purport to know everything about every sport. We start, luckily, formerly for me, I was an athlete at Tennessee in the early 90s where we were good at most things. And so I've got a lot of good connections in the sport world. So we, go to experts in that sport and just talk it through, work it through, and we pilot and go through the process. And obviously we've moved into special forces, law enforcement, even doing a lot of NASCAR and F1 stuff now. So it's exciting going into those new verticals because I learn a ton about these. You get into something novel, you think you know about race car driving until you get into race car driving.
Yeah. And so you're talking about angles. So one of my favorite podcasts that Harrison has done, well, all of you did, was with the F-16 pilot call sign Vader.
Yes.
And one of the coolest things about the podcast is when you're being followed by, he called him an attacker, I think he called it, or an offender. He said that when you're flying an F-16, when you look back, and I was driving my truck when I listened to this, when you looked back, first of all, you have to know the aircraft that is following you. But when you look back, you could tell by the vector of the nose cone on the jet if you were subject to get hit by the Gatling gun or an air-to-air heat-seeking missile. And all of that is visual. Okay, you're processing the angle or the vector of that nose cone and what your threat is before it happens. And then you made a comment earlier about playing in Death Valley, and he was talking about being under the pressure of all this going on with the weight, I think he said, of a gorilla on his back.
Yes.
And I didn't understand what that meant until I listened further in the podcast, and he was talking about 9G.
Yes.
And so what that is, that's 9 times your weight.
Yep.
So for me, I weigh 200 pounds. Now I wish I weighed 200 pounds. I wish I weighed it. But that is hard to imagine. And it's a lot like I would tell my friends, and this I have another question on this, but I would have friends on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday. We would be, hanging out somewhere, and they would start being critical of a player making a mistake in the game. And I would say to them, if you were in that position, I know you, we've known each other for 20 years. If you were placed in the same position that player is, you would piss well, first you would fall on the ground, you would curl up like a baby, and you would piss your pants and cry for your mama.
Yep.
And so when I was listening to Vader talk about that, plus the weight of 9 G's or the forces of 9 G's on his body, that was just hard for me to fathom. And then that's the stuff that you people measure, which is just amazing that, how far this project has gone since we first started messing around in the weight room.
Yeah. I mean, it is something that we don't take lightly, we get trashed a lot about how can what you do on a computer tell me how somebody is going to perform. Well, let me be clear. We can't be 100% accurate. We have no crystal ball. What I can tell you is we have the best tools that science has to offer to evaluate those types of processes and those decision making. The factor that we can't replicate, and nobody on this planet will be able to replicate, is real life. So Death Valley on a Saturday night. Look, if Jalen throws a pick, he comes back to the sidelines and he gets yelled at. He probably gets tweeted at and prank calls or whatever. But let me tell you something about a cop who may mistakenly see a 17-year-old take out a cell phone and think it's a gun and can't control his impulse. We can quantify that police officer's impulse control system for literally 3 hours using all kinds of metrics and give you all the data you want to know about his impulse control system. We cannot predict how that young man will react when he sees his life or his wife and kids flash before him. That's something that we cannot replicate. So we can tell you how an athlete is wired, how they can perform and stuff like that. But Saturday night, Death Valley against Alabama, we gotta do our best.
Yeah. And it's, and then you add the pressure of the tweets that he gets sent, his mom, his dad, his cousins, the probability of losing out on a first round draft pick. One play of a game can in some way affect the guy that would cost him millions of dollars if it's the wrong time in the wrong place. So yeah, you're correct. All right, so let me ask you this. Do professional organizations, or how many professional organizations, have people on their staffs now that are looking at this data? Because I know it's just, you and Scott and everyone there, you don't have enough time to travel to all these places. So do these teams have people within the organization?
Yeah. It's a great question. It varies by organization fairly significantly. So a team like the New York Jets has probably 9 PhDs on staff that deal with data analytics, and they may have one person who's in charge of S2. The Bills are another example. There's different layers. So there's somebody who's in charge of that particular product, and they're the translator. They're the liaison. So when they have trouble with somebody on Sundays, they're texting me or calling me on Monday, hey, how can we work with this player? How can we help this player? Then there's a person a step above them who integrates all of the data. So they're getting sleep data and recovery data. They're getting nutrition data. They're getting strength and conditioning data. They're getting the S2 data, and they're putting the big big puzzle together. So I think that teams are evolving. A lot of what you said is very true. For the most part, what we're seeing is at the college level, they're just forward thinking, and they're thinking about all of this. They've got people in place. They've got specialists that, have a PhD. It might be not in cognitive science, but it's in psychology or something, and has a familiar understanding with it. And so they're trying to integrate what we do into the coaching. Now, I will say this: I also have coaches at the pro level and the college level that will text or call with very specific questions. But for the most part, the performance teams these days have evolved since we've evolved, really. They were teams when we first got into this. As you know, the Saints were one of them, where it was like Jeff Ireland and some guys. And now they've built out some analytics people and things like that. So.
Yeah, the first time that you visited our pro day and Jack and I were walking you around, introducing you to people, they were, you were actually handing them the reports, the hard copies of guys' S2 scores, and they were just looking at them like, what is this?
I remember. So this is one of the funniest stories that I have from my S2 days. So, Rex Hogan. Yeah. So he was with the Bears at the time, but he's the assistant general manager of the Jets now. Well, Rex and my kids went to school together. He lived down the street from me, and we would get together at friend's house and we would watch the games on Sundays. And he was a big Bears fan, and we would get drunk and watch the games. And I'm at LSU at Pro Day in 2014, and in walks Rex. And I was like, what in God's name are you doing here? And he was like, this is what I do for a living, man. I'm a national scout for the Bears. I was like, oh my God, you're kidding me. This is a guy down the street. So that's
living in Nashville, he was hiding out incognito and didn't want you to know he was working for the Bears. Isn't that amazing?
That's wild. And now I consider him a close friend and a mentor. And yeah.
So what type of role do you see this having in the recruiting process of collegiate athletes?
Yeah.
And now, more importantly, probably than even recruiting, what about the transfer portal?
Yeah, the portal.
How has it worked for you guys maneuvering through these two?
Yeah. So we do have a recruiting platform now. And as you're aware of, it's on the Xbox. So LSU has a handful of Xboxes, and it's a shortened battery. So the full test is 40 to 45 minutes. The recruiting battery is about 20 minutes with some key skills. And in the portal, we've been approached by a couple of these recruiting services about potentially, especially in baseball and, the D1 guys, about potentially having an S2 portal that goes in, an S2 score that goes within. Again, we get beat down the door all the time for a scouting application and a recruiting application. And while I see the value in that, I think the better value is just understanding, here's our need. Let's find a player that fits that need. So, you know what I mean? We don't want to be, we're not in the business of telling you somebody can or can't process. Shit, man. I mean, these kids can process. They're SEC ball players. It's just how they process. That's way more informative. And if you talk to a quarterback coach like John Beck, who coaches CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, all of those guys, he has seen more quarterbacks not make it in the NFL, not because they weren't good quarterbacks or couldn't process information, but because they didn't match up with the scheme that they were trying to play in. And then they become a backup. And then so if we can we want to maximize the success on both sides, not just for the team, but for the kid too. Right. And so I'm wired this way. Here's how my play style is. Here's the kind of offense or defense I'm well suited for. Well, guess what? That's the kind of defense we play, or we have a role in this particular scheme. That's how we envision this going. I know it's hard because I think that takes a lot of coaching staffs. It's different. We see ourselves as game changers, and in game changers in a sport like football, where it's been done a certain way the whole time, we're ostracized a lot, about, this is so different. This is so new. But then you run across a guy like Dave Aranda, you know, at LSU, where, I mean, I remember sitting in his office and he stared at me with this blank look and he was like, I've been doing this wrong the whole time. I've been trying to force these kids to do my defensive scheme. I should be putting my scheme together based on what these kids can do. And it's like, yeah, if we could find 100,000 Dave Arandas, we'd be great as a company.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, Dave was the type of guy too, you know, because when you go to special teams, a lot of the linebackers and a lot of the defensive backs and those guys were on your four core special teams. But the guys that were left over, the veterans and maybe some of the young guys, the guys that were left over, in the skill positions, Dave would sit there between the two fields, you know, because this would be the defensive field, the offensive field, and you know, you always switch sides based on what team you were practicing. Dave would stand in the middle and he would set up scenarios or buckets. And I've seen him sit there with linebackers and safeties going through different scenarios that they were going to face that week.
Right.
And making sure, you know, just getting extra reps when other guys would have sat there and, shooting the bull with them. Dave was actually putting them in scenarios where they needed to improve. So he was getting those extra reps.
Yeah.
But, you know, on your this goes back, we were talking about, you know, coaches being hard to change, and coaches fall in love with their height, their size, their speed, and then they think, you know, and then they'll listen to what the counselor says, they'll listen to what the position coach says, the head coach says, and contrary to all of that, they feel like they can force them into a position and waste the player's time and waste their time, and then the player and the coach, like we said before, gets frustrated versus finding out. So S2, your goal ultimately is to become like a headhunter for CEOs, you know, that, you know, for businesses, you know, you hire a headhunter and y'all go out and you find the player that organization is looking for to play a very specific role on the offense or the defense.
We hope to be a part of that. You know, it's just, it's one piece of the puzzle. I mean, we really see ourselves as just helping you guys reduce uncertainty. So if a friend of yours said, "Hey, Tommy, there's this kid in LaForce Parish. I think the kid is phenomenal." That's all the information you have. What are you going to go do? Well, first off, you're going to go watch him play. That reduces uncertainty. You're going to talk to him and his family. That reduces uncertainty. You're going to put him, you know, look at his arm talent, make him throw, make him go through some scenarios, make him run. That reduces some uncertainty. Now we just want to be able to reduce some uncertainty, and can the kid make decisions in the way that you need him to?
Yeah. So when I was coaching at LSU, my friends would call me and we would talk, and, you know, we'd talk recruiting, but they would never really get that specific about who they were recruiting, or they'd say, "Hey, I'm going to be passing through Baton Rouge. If you want to, you know, if you got 30, 40 minutes, let's go grab a bite to eat." And I personally would never ask them who they were recruiting. Now, since I'm not working at LSU, they'll call me and say, "Hey, I need you to call. There's a kid at Denham Springs, or there's a kid at STM. STM's got a quarterback, an alley kid. Can you go check on the kid at STM?" Or somebody like that. But they never did it before, but they, you know, because their time is limited.
Yep.
Their access is limited. And I know everybody in the city, and, you know, I know everybody at least in the South, or somebody there on that staff. So I'll call them up and say, "Hey, tell me about this kid." And it's funny. So I've made a lot of these calls since I'm not working over there anymore. And I'll call 3 or 4 different people, because I know people in baseball, I know the strength coach, I know people in football, and I'll call 3 different people. If I get 2 or 3 different answers, I know we got a problem.
Yeah.
But if every one of those coaches, you know, tell me the same thing, then I think it's pretty accurate. So yeah, that's pretty neat.
New job.
All right. So yeah, new job. Yeah. Recruiting. I don't want any a part of that. So, all right. So here's a personal question. All right. Because of all the work that you've done at S2, and I know that you're a football fan, has your experience in all of these, and I think it's a rhetorical question. I think I know the answer, but with all of your experience, with all of these different evaluations that you've done, when you're watching a college football game, if you're watching the Vols play and you're at a party, you're in the neighborhood and you're having a watch party with all the Tennessee Vol fans, and the quarterback drops a ball and everybody goes, "That guy sucked." Do you we suck. All right. What's the first thing that goes through your mind? Do you want to go over there and correct them, or do you just let it slide? Like, are you able to separate your profession from?
Yes, I am. I am very non-confrontational, and I just watch the game for the love of the game. If you want that kind of thing, you got to go to Harrison, and Harrison. So if I need an S2 score on somebody, or if I need to know a kid's history, I text Rain Man because that kid knows. We've tested
the new guy.
We've tested probably 45,000 athletes. I'd say Harrison's got to know 42,000 of those scores, along with how many drops they had as a senior in high school and all this. So I think, I continue to watch sports just as a fan of watching sports and root for my teams. But I do constantly get texts from either people inside the company or outside of the company, like the kid for the Ravens, the rookie from the Ravens this year. He's leading the league in interceptions. And I swear to God, every time he gets an interception, I get a text from about 3 different people, 98 on the S2. It's like, okay, all right, that's great.
Oh yeah. So I wanted to ask that question. All right. So I got that out of the way.
It's been hard to watch my Vols for a long time now. So I'm just excited that we're above 500.
Yeah. Well, so let me tell you, so last year, my first year out of college or out of football. So last year was the first time since I was 10 years old or younger that I wasn't involved in some form of football. I mean, it had, for 50 years almost, I'd been involved with football. So the first fall out, Jill said, what do you want to do? You're not going to be involved in football. I said, I want to go on vacation. Let's go to an island somewhere. So she talked to some friends and she picked Grand Cayman Island. Okay. So when camp opened last year, I was at Grand Cayman and we had a blast, and we had friends that had been to Grand Cayman numerous times, and we actually went with them. So this year she goes, "Do you want to go to Grand Cayman when camp starts?" I go, "No. I want to go to Grand Cayman the week of the first game. I think, that's would be great that I'm there, I'm away from it, and I don't have to worry about the outcome of the game." So we ended up going with 2 fanatical couples that are LSU fans, fanatical fans. So it's our last night, and we had a blast while we were there. Our last night in Grand Cayman, the LSU Florida State game comes on, and we're watching it, and I'm laying on the sofa chilling, eating. We had all kinds of food, and I'm eating, and my 2 buddies, because they, Florida State, FSU throttled us this year again, and so they're throwing stuff. They're pissed off. One of my and these 2 guys are like, I've known them since we moved to Baton Rouge. One of them got so pissed off that he just went to bed after the third quarter. He missed the entire fourth quarter. And while we were watching it, they were like, "How can you be so calm? Like, you're not like jumping up and down. You're not pissed off. You don't celebrate." I said, "Guys, when you've done it as long as I have, you learn to separate, your emotions professionally from it because of all the stuff that's going on in the sideline." Like, I had a blast while I was there, but I have a job to do.
Right.
And I'm not a fan. I mean, I'm not. I love athletics, but I'm not a big enough fan that I'm going to lose my mind during a college football game. I might lose it on the sidelines or in
Yes.
the locker room before the game, but I'm not going to lose it just watching.
Yep.
All right. So we're getting close to the end. All right. So I know that y'all have a mobile lab that travels to different sites for testing. And I know that y'all have people in the organization, Harrison being one of them, that flies all over the country testing entire teams and organization. How much access does an individual like me or one of my sons or one of my fanatical neighbors next door have for S2?
Yeah, great question. So
Can anyone take it? Can anyone take the test?
Anyone can take the test. Anyone 12 years and over can take the test. And the access is somewhat limited in that we have partners around the country where they're considered S2 labs where you can go in and test. We are working right now with a partnership through a major sports training, all sports training that has maybe 470, I think, cities around the country where we're trying to get kiosks in there to where you can just go in and take a test. So right now you would probably, let's say, just say you're in Baton Rouge. We're in Baton Rouge a couple times a year for camps and showcases. Primarily for baseball, but we do some football stuff. And we also, I believe, may have a lab. Now, our closest lab would be Birmingham.
All right. So if I opened a facility here in Baton Rouge, we could have
very easily. Yes.
S2 kiosks.
Very easily. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
How can people find out more about S2?
Easiest way is the website, www.s2cognition.com.
Yeah. And you have the S2U section on there. You have podcast links, which the podcasts are amazing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Harrison does a good job. And I like the way, so for me, this is a one-man show, but I like how the three of you, you get Scott involved and you and Harrison. And I like that. Like sometimes I needed somebody to take part of the load off of me. And
it's fun. Yeah. So we just, interestingly, we just shot one with the leader of a special forces division, and his only request was we have to do it in person. So it was wild. Yeah, he came down and we shot it in the S2 headquarters, and it's the first time we've done with everybody in the same space. And I'll say it's cool because you can the conversation. I don't know. I like Zoom and Riverside and those kind of things, but sometimes the conversation is hard because you're kind of waiting for somebody to finish, and you got that kind of talking over. So it was pretty fun. Yeah. But yeah, the S2U section of the website really, is. Look, Tommy, I would love to say that I want this company to make $1 billion. That's not my goal. Like my goal in life, my real thrust is to just educate people about how the brain is involved in sports. And as you know, when we first got in there, there's a lot of people who think the eyes are connected to the muscles, and the brain doesn't do anything in the process. So if we can just educate people, so the S2U section has some white papers with data, performance data. It has a blog where we've written on things like athlete IQ and sports related IQ and just some thought, the 5 buckets of performance, and then our podcast, and then some academic papers that we've published, peer-reviewed papers that we've published. So if you're interested in cognition or, learning how the brain is involved in shooting a gun or flying a plane or playing football, we've probably got a lot of exciting information for you.
Good deal. Well, I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, love it, man.
Hey, I was more nervous about this episode, and I'm man enough to admit sometimes I get a little nervous, and I was a little nervous about this episode because I know you so well. So I guess we met in 1994, 95.
Yep.
So I've known you and consider you a good friend. So the pressure was on for this episode. So
That's awesome.
You coming on here.
Yeah, no, I love talking with you.
It.
Yeah. I still strive to be on the cover of V Up magazine, which has been my goal since that fall of 1994.
Yeah. So V Up magazine. So, all right. So Brandon ran track. We're going to throw it out there. He was a distance guy, and they were nicknamed the Weasel. And I didn't have y'all that snatching and cleaning, or your program for the lack of technology that we had then. I thought we did a good job, and everything that we did was based on y'all's injury report. Really, I did. I just took the last 4 years of data that Rollo had. Rollo was a big database guy, so Rollo had every injury. And so I designed a program based on y'all's injuries, the most common injuries, from running all the miles that y'all did. And but we had a lot of fun. So we did V-ups was one of the
V-ups, burpees, and box jumps, man, were my life for a good solid 2 years.
Yeah, that was explosive as we got, was jumping up on
But let me tell you, it's the first time ever in my life at that point, because I obviously had played sports until that point. It was in college that I was doing something that I felt like was functionally relevant. Right? Because if you got a bunch of distance runners going in there to bench press, we're doing it just to look good, right? I mean, just because we don't want these bird chests when we go into the shirtless into the training room, we don't want to get laughed at. That's why we would do bench presses and stuff. But it was clear that you had a very specific goal about, okay, this is functional strength that distance runners need. So they kind of, I take that to heart. I take what we do as a model off of that. Like, we're trying to find specific cognitive demands for a position or for a sport or a game. So yeah, you were ahead of the time back then.
Yeah. Yeah. And y'all were always the last group. It was at 5 because I started with the throwers around 2, and then I had the sprinters come in around 3. And then at 4, I had all the jumpers, and then late, y'all would come in. And so my capacity
to deal with us,
to deal with you guys was pretty low, but we had a lot of fun.
You had to be in your 20s at that point, huh?
Early 30s.
See, and
early 30s.
Like Watts, Doug Brown was there, but George Watts was my middle distance coach, and he was 34 at the time. And I remember being 34 thinking to myself, there's no effing way I could deal with a bunch of 18, 19-year-old punks, because that's the reason why we were called the Weasels, because we were punks. Yeah. You messed with one of us, you got the whole gaggle.
Oh man, we had so much fun. Oh, it was a blast. And like my goal is to open a facility, a brick and mortar facility. And that we've talked about that a lot. But my wife goes, can you do that? And I said, my career started with young kids, coaching junior high and high school kids. And then my career, if I end coaching junior high and high school kids, it's as rewarding as it could possibly get, because my career had gone full circle.
Yeah.
And, and it wasn't my goal, just like yours. My goal was never to be the head string coach at the University of Tennessee, or I wouldn't have left. My goal was to just, go in the weight room and have fun, and it was never about how many wins. In fact, I knew nothing about the scoring system.
Oh, that's true. That is true. You have botched that before.
Yeah. So my goal was just to help people improve performance, and that's what your goals. That's you, Scott, Ryan, Harrison, the whole crew.
Yep.
So I appreciate you coming on here, and I haven't seen Ryan in forever. So tell Ryan.
Yeah, it's just because we've gotten so, we've grown so much. Ryan heads up the Major League Baseball stuff, and that is a year-round operation. I mean, those guys could say, hey, there's a 13-year-old in the Dominican, and Ryan's on a plane, Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. And y'all test everyone there, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
y'all test every player that they have that's coming
Yep.
out just to be sure that you have data on them. It's amazing. All right, man. Well, I appreciate it.
All right, Coach. Thanks for having me on.
All right, buddy. Bye-bye. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed, and I say this a lot, but I truly hope that you enjoyed this one as much as I did, because this one was absolutely a blast. Please subscribe, leave us a review, and then share this with your friends. It's important to help us to continue to grow and touch more people. For more information about the Moffitt Method programs and everything that we have to offer, please email us at themoffittmethod.fit. Please visit our website, themoffittmethod.fit, or email us at info@themoffittmethod.fit. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.